Most people spend their entire lives walking through the world with their emotional gates left wide open. A careless word from a stranger ruins their morning. A sudden, unexpected change in their schedule sparks a wave of intense anxiety. Someone treats them with disrespect, and immediately, a surge of anger takes over their mind, dictating their every action. If you live this way, you are operating like a puppet, and the entire world is holding your strings. Society profits from your reactivity. The media, the algorithms, and the toxic individuals in your life all feed on your emotional volatility. They want you outraged, fearful, and impulsive. Because a mind that cannot regulate its own weather is a mind that is effortlessly controlled. But thousands of years ago, the Stoic philosophers engineered the ultimate rebellion. They discovered that true power does not come from conquering the external world, but from establishing absolute, unshakable sovereignty over your internal state. They realized that when you learn to govern your emotions, you become a ghost to the chaos around you. You become emotionally untouchable. People will attempt to provoke you, and their efforts will shatter against your silence. Circumstances will try to crush you, and you will remain deeply rooted in your own peace. This is not about suppressing your feelings. It is a masterclass in emotional command. You are going to learn how to feel deeply without ever letting those feelings sit in the driver's seat of your life. The moment someone hurts you, something inside you reacts almost instantly. Your chest tightens, your mind starts racing, and before you even realize it, you're already forming a response. You want to explain, to correct, to make them understand exactly what they did. It feels natural. It feels justified. But hidden inside that moment is something far more important than the situation itself. The second your reaction becomes predictable, it becomes controllable. And that's where everything begins to shift. The instinct is to move toward the noise, to argue, to chase clarity, to demand closure. But what if strength isn't found in expression, but in restraint? What if the real power isn't proving your worth, but refusing to place it in someone else's hands at all? You don't control what happens, but you control how deeply it reaches you. And once you understand that, your silence is no longer empty. It becomes intentional, not avoidance, not weakness, but absolute control. The kind that doesn't need to be seen because it's felt in the way. You choose not to react. Think about the last time someone hurt you. The moment itself might fade, but the reaction stays. The replaying, the overthinking, the quiet conversations you keep having in your head long after everything is over. It's rarely just the event that lingers. It's how deeply it pulled you in. That urge to respond, to make them understand, feels automatic. But if you slow it down, something becomes clear. The urgency isn't coming from clarity. It's coming from emotion. And emotion in that state is loud, but not always truthful. It convinces you that you need to act now. That silence means weakness. That if you don't respond immediately, you're losing. The Stoics understood that the first reaction is rarely the right one. It's just the fastest one, driven by ego and the need to regain control. But reacting in that state doesn't restore control. It gives it away. Because once someone can predict your reaction, they can influence it. Your response becomes part of a pattern, and patterns are easy to read. This is where people lose something without noticing. Every reaction reveals what unsettles you, what triggers you, and what pulls you off balance. Once that becomes visible, it becomes usable. One side reacts, the other observes. One side is emotional, the other becomes stable by default. And just like that, the balance is gone. The goal is never to remove emotion, but to refuse to be ruled by it. When emotion takes over, your awareness narrows. Everything collapses into that moment. No perspective, no distance, no intention, just reaction. And reaction always ties you to something external. Something outside of you is now dictating your internal state. Instead of asking what happened, you must ask what is in your control right now. And the answer is always the same. Your thoughts, your interpretation, and your response. Not them, not their actions, not their intentions. Just you. This doesn't limit you, it grounds you. Because when you stop trying to control everything else, you finally gain control over yourself. That's why discipline matters. Not suppression, but space. Space between what you feel and what you do. Because in that space, you are no longer reacting. You are choosing. And over time, that choice changes everything. You become harder to provoke. You stop feeding patterns that once controlled you, and you start moving with intention instead of impulse. You stop seeing every situation as something that demands a response. You start recognizing that not every action deserves your energy. And more importantly, not every feeling deserves immediate expression. That doesn't make you distant or cold. It makes you intentional. It means your actions are no longer driven by impulse but by choice. And choice is where power exists. Over time, you're no longer caught in the same cycles of reaction. You don't replay conversations in your head as often. You don't feel the same need to prove, to explain, or to justify. Not because you don't care, but because you've realized that your peace is not something to negotiate. It's something to protect. And protecting it starts with understanding that your response is yours to control, no matter what happens around you. What happens when you pause instead? Not a forced pause, but a real internal step back. At first it feels unnatural, almost uncomfortable, because you're interrupting a pattern that has likely been running for years. The urge to react is still there. The thoughts are still forming, but you don't act on them right away. In that space, the intensity that once felt overwhelming starts to lose its grip. Not because the situation has changed, but because your relationship to it has. That space you create is where control begins to return. When you're reacting instantly, you're not choosing your response. You're releasing it. You're letting whatever rises to the surface dictate your behavior. But when you pause, you introduce awareness. You start to see the reaction before it happens. You notice the impulse instead of becoming it. And once you can see it, you are no longer completely bound by it. This is where silence enters the picture, not as an absence, but as a deliberate presence. A choice not to engage in the usual way. And that kind of silence carries weight. It's not empty. It's intentional. Most people are used to noise when conflict arises. Raised voices, long messages, repeated attempts to defend. That's the pattern. So when that pattern is suddenly broken, it creates a kind of tension that words cannot replicate. Uncertainty has a way of making people reflect in ways they normally wouldn't. The common misunderstanding is that silence equals indifference. But the reality is often the opposite. It takes far more effort to remain composed than it does to react emotionally. Reacting is immediate and instinctive. It requires no discipline. But choosing silence requires restraint and clarity. It requires you to prioritize your state over your impulse. That is control in its most refined form. When you choose not to explain yourself in the heat of the moment, you remove yourself from the emotional exchange. You're no longer feeding the cycle. And without that energy, the dynamic shifts. Most interactions rely on mutual participation. But when one side steps out of that loop, the rhythm is disrupted. And in that disruption, the other person is left without the reaction they anticipated. They're left to sit with what they said or did without immediate feedback. And that often creates more reflection than any argument ever could. Silence, when chosen with intention, comes from strength. You're not running from the situation. You're refusing to engage with it in a way that compromises your clarity. You're giving yourself time to process and to decide whether engagement is even necessary. And sometimes, the more time you give it, the less necessary it becomes. What once felt urgent starts to feel optional. There's also a shift in how you are perceived. When you don't react the way people expect, it challenges their assumptions. They can't easily categorize your response because it doesn't follow the usual pattern. That unpredictability in a controlled sense changes how the interaction unfolds. It's no longer about pulling a reaction out of you. That door is closed. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. This reflects the idea of listening to yourself. Before you speak, observing your thoughts, your emotions, and your impulses, and allowing them to settle before you decide what to do with them. Because what you say in the heat of the moment often reflects your reaction, not your intention. As you practice this, you start to feel less pulled into situations that once consumed you. Not because you don't notice them, but because they no longer have the same hold on your attention. You're not as quick to engage, not as quick to respond. And that creates a grounded distance that allows you to remain steady even when things around you are not. The pause becomes automatic. The silence becomes comfortable. And with that comes a kind of quiet confidence. You don't feel the same need to assert yourself in every situation. You're willing to let things unfold without forcing an outcome. What once felt like something that demanded your attention now becomes something you can observe without being consumed by it. You gain control over how deeply anything affects you, and that control becomes one of the most powerful tools you can carry. Imagine someone says something that would normally trigger you. Maybe it's dismissive or disrespectful. In the past, that moment would have pulled you in instantly. But this time, you don't rush. You stay composed. In that steadiness, the entire dynamic begins to shift. You acknowledge what needs to be acknowledged. Nothing more, nothing less. There is no over-explaining, no emotional overflow, no attempt to make them fully understand you in that moment. You respond with precision, and then you stop. You don't chase the conversation further than it needs to go. You don't try to force resolution from someone who may not be capable of giving it. That restraint removes the script they were prepared to follow. Most interactions operate on mechanical patterns. Someone provokes, the other reacts, and the situation escalates. But when you refuse to play your expected role, the structure breaks. There is no escalation because there is nothing feeding it. You create a kind of silence that is the absence of predictability. And that's where uncertainty enters the other person's expectations. They are met with something they can't easily read, something measured. It is no longer about pulling you into the interaction. It becomes about understanding why you didn't move the way they expected. This is where reflection begins, because the usual pattern was interrupted. When you were constantly explaining yourself, you were offering control. You were giving others the ability to evaluate and approve your life. But without that constant stream of justification, that control is reduced. Real honesty and ownership emerge. When you no longer negotiate your place in the world,